Welcome to History in a Hairspread, where I, Haya, try to get through a moment in history or literature before Poppyssed Bun here, Poppy, finishes a treat. Today we're eating mint from our mint patch, and I better get started because she's about to dash. Today we're going to talk about women in Restoration theater in England. But I guess Restoration kind of gave that away. Anywho, let's begin. So, following the English Civil War, where the Roundheads, the Puritans, and the Parliamentarians temporarily toppled the monarchy, Oliver Cromwell ruled for a while. After his death, his son took over, but he wasn't very popular and he wasn't a war hero like his dad. He just continued doing things like outlawing theater, which Cromwell had done, and other forms of fun. And the English people were having none of it anymore, so they brought Charles II, son of Charles I, whom they had beheaded, back and asked him to restore the monarchy, thus the Restoration. A whole lot goes on there politically, but we're going to focus on theater, because a major thing happened in theater. Women were allowed on stage for the first time in England. This has been happening in other countries and locations across the world, but England was, well, behind. Not that linear progress is a thing. Anywho, so we get women on the London stage for the very first time, which is good and bad, because women on the London stage means that women are finally playing female roles, but those women are also considered unseemly. There's an equation of sexual liberty and or prostitution with performing for women, not men. Men can be honorable and perform. So we have a bunch of women who are, relatively speaking, who are starting to perform on the London stage. And a number of these women are also taken to become King Charles II's mistresses. So that's part of where this conflation of sex and acting comes from, but mostly it comes from the patriarchy. Among these women is Nell Gwyn, who is the second woman, possibly the third, to appear on the London stage. She is one of Charles II's favorite mistresses and even has a child by him, which is really interesting. The first woman, however, Maggie, performed the role of Desdemona as her debut in Shakespeare's Othello. And that changed everything. In Othello, there's a scene where Emilia, the wife of Iago, and kind of Desdemona's maid, but it's complicated. Oh, Poppy, hop back into frame. No one wants to watch me just in a pile of mint. Poppyssed. Part of Desdemona and Emilia. Emilia is sort of Desdemona's maid. It's more complicated than that, but they have this undressing scene where Emilia takes off Desdemona's clothes and changes her into her nightgown. In previous productions, when it was all men, Poppy, your crown is falling off. How are we supposed to restore the monarchy? That scene was just that, an undressing scene. It was an intimate scene between women, played by men, and it represented their moment of unity before tragedy strikes. Yes, Poppy. However, once the role of Desdemona was played by a woman, and bear in mind that just Desdemona was played by a woman at this point, there wasn't a woman playing Emilia yet. I love you, you have more mint on the floor. Oh, we have a sexualization of this scene, where Desdemona's undressing becomes a sexual thing rather than a moment of intimacy platonically between these women. It doesn't become a homoerotic thing, it's for the male gaze. So once we have female bodies on stage, then they're immediately sexualized, and that's a common recurring trend here. However, we're not just seeing women performing on the London stage, we're also seeing the works of women on the London stage, which makes for an interesting twist, because the roles women get to play are also different, because for the first time in England, they can also be written by women. And that's where we get Elizabeth Carey and Aphra Behn, who's out of reach. But they're both incredible women. We're going to get to Aphra Behn in a second, hopefully, if Poppy doesn't finish this. And We're going to start with Elizabeth Carey's Tragedy of Mariam, which is arguably one of her most famous pieces. It's, I think, my favorite of hers. And the Tragedy of Mariam does something revolutionary in England. The women talk to each other. They talk to each other about things other than men. They have power. They get divorced, which is relatively new in England anyway. There's a variety of women. They're not specific tropes. They're actually complex characters who are allowed to be multiple things. And they have power. All of this is revolutionary. Then you have Aphra Behn. Aphra Behn is a fascinating figure, not just because she's a prolific writer in every way, that's Poppy shaking my laptop, but also because she has a very mysterious childhood, possibly by her own doing, where she purposely obfuscated her own childhood, and she was a spy. She and Christopher Marlowe, another playwright, were both spies for England during the Anglo-Dutch War. She then went to debtor's prison afterward because the king didn't pay her. Poppy, you want me to take that off? We're going to take off our crown. Yeah. Come eat the mint. So she went to debtor's prison, and then she started writing plays and novels and poems and all sorts of other things. But we're going to focus on her plays. And her plays have basically proto-feminist themes. We can't call it feminism because that wasn't a term that was coined yet, but they are proto-feminist in the way that they empower women. Poppy, will you be cute on camera, please? You're adorable. There we go. Such a good model. She's also a widow, which means she has actually some power over her own estate, which is relatively unique. And she hangs out with the other men in theater, which kind of sullies her reputation, but she kind of loves it. They're called libertines, which basically means they're sex positive and they have a lot of fun. But the English are just coming out of this temporary Puritan age, so they're in this weird crossroads of they love that Charles II loves to party, but they're also still in this culture shock, and women get blamed, including Aphra Behn. But that doesn't mean that her plays aren't produced, because they are several times. In fact, it's possible that Nell Gwyn herself was in one of Aphra Behn's plays. So women supporting women in Restoration theater. In The Rover, she even promotes the agenda of Charles II to the Cavaliers, who were the monarchists of the English Civil War. And that becomes one of her most popular plays, and it's also one of the most taught now. So if you're in a class about theater in this period of time, then you'll probably read The Rover, in which case, enjoy. It's really interesting. It has a lot to talk about in terms of female agency and violence against women, and gender roles. And all of that was pretty subversive at the time, which, I mean, maybe it shouldn't have been, but she was changing the game, which is fantastic. Not everyone loved that she was changing the game. There was one play called The Female Wits, which was published anonymously, but it was definitely a bunch of male playwrights who wrote it. And it was them targeting both individual women in theater, Aphra Behn among them, and the general idea of women being in theater, specifically being playwrights in theater. They laid out this idea that authorship is a male prerogative and women should be silent, essentially. So it's this continuing idea that women shouldn't be in any control of the cultural narrative, which allows men to keep a tight grip on historiography. And Aphra Behn would have none of that. These men condemned the female wits as libertine. Again, they said the role of women is silence and creativity is alien to women. But I think we've disproved them over time, because we don't know who those male playwrights are, and frankly, we don't really do a lot of restoration comedy. But Aphra Behn is one of the few who's still relatively popular, definitely often taught, and at least Arden deemed it worthy to talk about Elizabeth Carey. Highly recommend Arden, by the way, if you're looking at early modern plays. So, things are going to change with James II, Charles II's brother, who inherits the throne. He has other problems with the populace. He's not so connected to theater, and he's overthrown in the Glorious Revolution. And what happens in the Glorious Revolution? They turn to his daughter. The English people decide, we don't like this king. And instead of searching for another male contender, they bring in James II's daughter, Anne. Mary, sorry. Anne is the next queen. Their daughter. They bring in James II's daughter, Mary, and her husband, William, to be co-rulers. So there's no way to say for certain whether all of this female agency on the stage had anything to do with what happened next culturally, but there is a pattern in history of ties between what happens in art and what happens in life. So whether it's correlation or causation, Aphra Behn, Elizabeth Carey, Nell Gwyn, and their ilk laid out a precedent of female agency, and next thing you know, the English people were clamoring for a queen. Poppy has decided that it's much more interesting to look under my desk than finish this mint, so I guess we're done. Poppy, will you come say goodbye to the people? We'll see you next time. Poppy! Bye!